Welcome to FilterBoxx WHMIS GHS training module. The FilterBoxx mission. We provide sustainable and efficient water treatment solutions to our customers through expertise and innovation. Our vision is to be the preferred partner for those who value water as much as we do. The Ovivo values are ownership, integrity, expertise, teamwork, and innovation. Welcome to FilterBoxx Water Treatment WHMIS training module. The introduction will cover legislative requirements and compare WHMIS education versus training in site-specific WHMIS. The topics covered throughout the module will touch on important WHMIS elements and will assist employees to apply these WHMIS elements to their handling of chemicals in their day-to-day activities. The exam will exercise your skills and knowledge of WHMIS elements and by applying them to site-specific and job-specific safety documents. These documents will include SDS's formal hazardous assessments and site-specific emergency response plans. The passing grade for the exam is 80%, and you will have to submit a copy of your emergency response plan for your site. Once complete, we will provide a certificate showing that FilterBoxx specific WHMIS training has been completed. As a company policy, all FilterBoxx employees are required to have a generic WHMIS education certificate. This leads to the follow-up question on who needs to complete site-specific WHMIS training. Well, any worker that works with or around hazardous products requires site-specific WHMIS training. Working with includes handling, storing, using, disposing, and shipping and receiving of hazardous chemicals, as well as supervisors who supervise workers doing those tasks. And working around means that there may be a risk of exposure because of products are in storage or being used in your work area. This becomes important, of course, if there is a spill response required. To complete the training module, you will have already completed a generic WHMIS certificate. WHMIS stands for Workplace Hazardous Material Information System and is aligned with GHS, which stands for Global Harmonized System. WHMIS education is about the elements of WHMIS, such as the symbols, labels, and how to identify and classify chemicals. In contrast, site-specific or job-specific training applies those elements to the tasks in your day-to-day activities. This includes your knowledge of the chemicals you use, hazard identification and safe work practices, spill response, and emergency procedures, as well as storage and disposal practices. Health Canada is the government body responsible for the overall WHMIS supplier-related laws. This legislation includes the Hazardous Product Act and Hazardous Products Regulations. WHMIS is also regulated in the workplace by the provinces and territories. This is usually found under occupational health and safety legislation. Suppliers and employers must use and follow WHMIS requirements for labeling and safety data sheets for hazardous products sold, distributed, or imported into Canada. WHMIS in the workplace helps ensure workers have the information they need to work safely with hazardous products. Legislation also outlines the worker and employer responsibilities, and it establishes requirements for worker education and site-specific training. These all lead to the fundamental rights of all workers, and that's the right to know about hazards and controls, and the right to participate in the health and safety of your workplace, and finally, the right to refuse unsafe work. The responsibilities of employers and supervisors is to assess the worksite and inform workers of hazards and controls, as well as provide necessary training to keep employees safe. This includes establishing policies and procedures, providing PPE, and ensuring that STSs and labeling are readily available and in use. We are all workers first, and it is our responsibility to apply training and best practices to ensure the safety of everyone. This includes following policies and safe work practices, participating and applying training, only performing work that we're competent to do so, and reporting unsafe conditions or behaviors. Ultimately, the goal of site-specific WHMIS training is for workers to be able to answer the following 4 questions in their day-to-day activities. The first question is, what are the hazards? Then, how do I protect myself? What do I do if there's an incident? And finally, how do I get more information? When a product is covered by the Hazardous Product Act and is classified as a hazardous product under WHMIS that is intended for use, handling, or storage in a workplace in Canada, it must have a safety data sheet available on site. These are stored in an STS site-specific inventory-based library, frequently called the STS binder. As well, these STSs are stored on a central database. As mentioned, for you to complete the training exam, you will need to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding of WHMIS classification and identification elements, as well as being familiar with the sections of an STS. It's important to know the location of your STS binder. In the next section, we will cover the education elements. Please use this information and apply to your site-specific documents and practices. WHMIS education elements seen here are the foundation of identifying and classifying chemicals. They are the tools of WHMIS to assist workers in keeping them safe in the handling and storage of chemicals in the workplace. These include pictograms, safety data sheets, supplier labels, and worksite labels, as well as hazard groups, classes, and categories. We will use some common water treatment chemicals and STSs to identify and explore these tools. There are 10 WHMIS symbols or pictograms that you need to recognize, and the hazards that are associated with them. Here I've grouped them into health hazards and physical hazards. The first one, skull and crossbones, can cause death or toxicity with short exposures. The health hazard symbol indicates that it may cause or be suspected of causing serious health effects. The exclamation mark indicates that it may cause less serious health effects. The biohazardous infectious material symbol is not a GHS pictogram, but is widely used. Corrosive. Now, corrosive is indicated in both groups, health and physical, because it indicates that it's corrosive to both skin and eyes, as well as metals. The reactivity hazard. Flame over circle indicates an oxidizer. The gas cylinder indicates gases under pressure. And then finally, flammable. WHMIS signal words and hazard statements. The 2 signal words that alert workers to the overall hazard level of a product are danger and warning. The highest level of hazard must appear on the supplier label and is found in Section 2 of an STS. Warning is a less serious message than danger. Hazard statements are standardized phrases that help describe a product's hazards. These are physical hazard statements and health hazard statements. These are also found in Section 2 of an SDS. It's important to be able to differentiate between physical hazard statements and health hazard statements, as these provide important information to keep everybody safe. Health hazards focus on the routes of exposure. Precautionary statements. Precautionary statements are another set of standardized phrases to help ways to reduce or prevent exposure to the hazardous products in your workplace. These statements are also found on Section 2 of an SDS and on supplier labels. It is important to consider that detailed information on precautionary statements can be found throughout other sections of SDSs. We will look closer at the sections of SDSs. The WHMIS classification and identification takes physical hazard groups and health hazard groups that we've already mentioned and takes those and breaks those down into classes. So for the physical hazard group, there are 19 physical hazard classes. And for the health hazard group, there are 12 health hazard classes. Further to this, those classes are broken down into categories. Categories are ranked based on the level of risk or hazard for that particular category. For example, Category 1 is a more significant hazard than Category 5. There is an alternative ranking as well, where they indicate a Category 1, a Category 1A, 1B, 2, 2A, and so on. Each group has a class, and each class will have one or more categories. Exploring classification and identification even further. Here we've got an example. It's important to note that hazard categories help to identify the degree of hazard within a class, as mentioned, with using a numbering system, 1 being high, 5 being low, or using the subcategory options. The example here, potassium permanganate crystals, classes and categories have been listed in order as shown on the SDS in Section 2. It's important to recognize the high hazard effects. For example, exposure routes are inhalation, ingestion, skin contact, and eye contact. In each of these exposure routes, potassium permanganate causes severe burns and severe eye damage. As well, the physical hazard, being an oxidizer, means it will react readily with most organic material or reducing agents. Oxidizers are severe fire hazards as they greatly intensify combustion. The classification and identification WHMIS elements. When we bring these elements together, like the examples on the right, we can compare the same hazard group and hazard class, and then see how the categories correspond to the pictogram, the signal words, and the hazard statements. It's important to note the physical hazard statement word use. For example, extremely flammable versus highly flammable versus flammable versus combustible. Again, the signal words and the pictograms loosely correspond to the hazard categories. Similarly, with a health hazard, the statements and their word use indicate the severity of the risk. For example, the serious eye damage versus causes serious eye irritation, and finally causes eye irritation. Again, they loosely correspond to the word, signal word, and the pictogram, and the hazard categories. These help identify the risks in the workplace on the supplier label and when examining the SDS. Another WHMIS fundamental element is supplier labels and worksite labels. Supplier labels are created by the supplier, manufacturer, or importer. It's based on the information from the SDS, and it must have the 6 required elements. It may have supplementary product information, and it also must be available in English or French. A worksite label is created by the worker, and it's based on information on the supplier label, which may include pictograms, signal words, and hazard statements. And it should be in a language appropriate to the worksite. A signal word and pictograms are optional on worksite labels. These elements listed here, the product identifier, the name of the product, the hazard pictograms, signal word, hazard statements, precautionary statements, and the supplier information must be provided on a supplier label. For a worksite label, you must indicate the product identifier as well as the precautionary statements and a reference to see the SDS. Here's an example of a supplier label transferred to a worksite label. What's important to note is that there's 2 shared elements. That's the product identifier and the precautionary statements. WHMIS standardized SDS sections. Being familiar with safety data sheets is crucial to understanding the 4 fundamental site-specific training questions. SDSs must have 16 sections of information, and as shown in the table below, each of the 16 sections must be identified by a heading, identical to the ones seen here. A few questions will test your ability to locate specific information from these sections for chemicals you use in the workplace. SDSs are critical in the use of WHMIS in the workplace. You must regularly review safety data sheets because it's important to be familiar with the hazards and controls of the product before you start to use it. You can think of an SDS as having the 4 main purposes, and they provide information on the identification of the product and the supplier, the hazards associated with it, both physical and health, and prevention. These are the steps you can take to work safely, reduce or prevent exposure. Response. These are the appropriate responses in various situations, like first aid, fire, or accidental release. However, it's also important to understand SDSs cover information about the potential hazards of that chemical, but may not be specific about the required safe work procedures needed in your workplace. Use SDSs in combination with site-specific hazard assessments and emergency response plans. And always, if you need more information, always ask your supervisor. Using SDSs and hazard assessments for reducing risks in your job tasks. There is a certain order you should follow. The hierarchy of control starts with elimination. This is the most desirable method for addressing risks. If you can eliminate the hazard or substitute for a safer alternative, engineering controls are the next best option. Engineering involves using work equipment, physical changes to the workplace, or other means to prevent workers from being exposed to the hazard. For example, ventilation is one of the most important engineering controls available for improving or maintaining the air quality of a work environment. And while Controls are listed in the order of their effectiveness. All types of controls should be utilized to reduce the risks, and they often work best in combination. From the hierarchy of controls, personal protective equipment is also found in Section 8 of an SDS. This section indicates exposure limits, engineering controls, and personal protective equipment measures that can be used to minimize hazard exposure. Often, the focus of PPE recommendations is on the potential routes of occupational exposure, which include inhalation, skin contact, eye contact, and ingestion. It would then seem logical that the recommendations for PPE are to prevent illness or injury by these routes of exposure, such as the appropriate eye, skin, or respiratory protection needed. So look for these special requirements. PPE requirements that are captured on the SDS give basic requirements. Site and task requirements may include additional PPE requirements and practices. It's important to review and consult your hazard assessments for all the tasks completed in the workplace. Section 4, First Aid Measures. Like health hazard statements and PPE recommendations, first aid measures provide information on the potential routes of exposure. First aid response can be a critical aspect for any chemical exposure incident. It's a legislative requirement to ensure that sufficient first aid equipment is provided and used in our daily activities, as well as that workers are trained in first aid. In any chemical exposure event, it's important to know what chemical is involved. This reinforces the fundamental purpose of WHMIS, especially identification and labeling requirements, as well as having SDS documentation on site. Further information on first aid measures. It's important to understand that the recommendations are simple and direct, and they're intended for the regular first aider. They are not intended for the absolute worst case exposure event, but provide critical information on the recommendations and in which order first aid measures should be carrying out. Taking care of urgent priorities first. They are there to protect the first aid provider. This is a reminder to always protect yourself first when providing first aid. To cover some important basics in the sections 7 for handling and storage and for 13 for disposal, generally, best practices for all chemical storage are as follows. Store in a dry, cool, well-ventilated area out of direct sunlight and away from heat sources, as well as incompatible materials. Always store in the original labeled container and keep containers tightly closed when not in use and when empty. It's a good reminder that empty containers may contain hazardous residues. It's also important to protect labels and keep them visible. Incompatible chemicals give an undesired chemical reaction when mixed. This usually refers to substances that will react and cause an imminent threat or health and safety concern through explosion, fire, or the formation of toxic materials or gases. Disposal procedures may vary from site to site when it comes to removing the waste and materials from site. Before removal, it's important to identify the best practices within the handling of chemicals at their end of use, like empty containers and spill response material waste practices. As we conclude the training module, I think it's important to acknowledge that we have not gone through all 16 sections of an SDS in great detail. However, it's important to understand the WHMIS element basics and the contents of an SDS and apply those to your workplace practices. By doing so, you'll be able to answer the 4 fundamental site-specific training questions. This also leads to the question, is all the information I need on the SDS? And the answer is not necessarily. A lot of health hazard information is written in general terms. In addition, SDSs are often written for many different uses or applications of that product. The handling and safety precautions also may not be specific to our workplace. So it's critical to follow the training provided, including your standard operating procedures, your formal hazard assessments, and your emergency response plans. As always ask your supervisor if you're concerned about safety in the workplace. The last step in the training module is to review your site-specific emergency response plan. Doing so is a vital proactive practice. Annually is also a minimum. Site-specific ERPs remind us what to do and where to go in emergency situations, as well as confirms important procedures and where first aid and emergency equipment are located. You have now completed the presentation portion of this training module. You will need site-specific documentation like SDSs and job hazard analysis. Once you complete your exam, please provide an emergency response plan as well. Send it to philip.carlson@ovivowater.com. Thank you and good luck.